Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habari gani? This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, Black August 16, 2025. Today's program is an homage on the 60th anniversary of the Watts Revolt of 1965. First, we commence with our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Professor LaShawn Harris, Associate Professor of History at University of Michigan, East Lansing, and author of the book Tell Her Story, Eleanor Bumpurs and the Police Killing That Galvanized New York City. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Professor Stefan Bradley, Charles Hamilton Houston, 1915 Professor of Black Studies and History at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and author of the book If We Don't Get It, A People's History of Ferguson. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Alice Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Robert Glasper, Milt Jackson, Barry Flanagan, Errol Garner, and more. It's a packed program, so sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Every day our brothers suffer and die. The tears down their eyes, we wonder why. 7 diamond mines are in Ethiopia, rounding about Africa. And when you take a stock, everybody have and they no have none. It's a disgrace. Wanga see about the Africa. Run on. Wanga see ya where the happen in Africa. Come every time.
Molweni Ekai, this is Sister Luyanda Kuboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for this Tuesday, August 22nd, designed to provide you with our story of struggle for a global society based on democratic redistribution of economic power and justice. August 22nd, 1791. The Haitian Revolution begins, leading to the emancipation of the Africans of Haiti and the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere. August 22nd, 1843. Henry Highland Garnett, a Back to Africa leader, calls for a general slave strike and the violent overthrow of slavery and the slave-tocracy of the United States government. August 23rd, 1976. Over 200,000 African workers go on a national strike in solidarity with the student youth-led Soweto uprising, increasing the militant resistance to European settler colonialism in South Africa. August 24th, 1831. Under the leadership of Nat Turner, huge slave revolts break out in Virginia, adding to the European capitalist class drive towards the elimination of slavery as a too dangerous mode of production for their survival. August 25, 1978. The Front for the Liberation of Nicaragua, the FSLN, seizes the National Palace and overthrows the brutal U.S.-installed Somoza dictatorship, thereby bringing into power the popular organized masses, herald a people's popular revolution. August 25, 1640. Linga, an African sister warrior, clad in animal skins and carrying an axe, bow and arrows, and a sword, led the Congo people to defeat the Portuguese invaders. With one swing, she cut off the heads of the colonizers. In 1580, Portuguese historians reported of an African confederacy in Monomatapa that had armies of women. August 26, 1966. Namibia Day is celebrated. Namibia, formerly Southwest Africa, a German colony, moves from peaceful protest and petition for freedom to armed struggle under the leadership of Sem Jumo, signifying the bankruptcy of appealing to the consciousness of the Nazi colonial masters. August 26, 1733. Nanny, legendary chief sorceress and woman leader of the Jamaican Windward Maroon rebels, whose successful assaults against the British slaveocracy gave her mythical adoration among the African masses. She was the sister of Cujo, a Maroon leader whose daring military actions made her the most distinguished of all Maroon leaders. August 27, 1963. Dr. King leads the famous March on Washington for Jobs, Peace, and Freedom. August 27, 1963. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, famed Pan-Africanist, dies in Ghana. Dr. Du Bois, without a doubt, the greatest African scholar of the United States, originally assumed the crisis of racism was one of ignorance, but after authoring over 30 books, hundreds of papers, and involvement with most of the major social change movements of the 20th century, concluded that without the elimination of capitalism and imperialism, people of color would forever be oppressed by the United States and Western Europe. August 28, 1918. Big Bill Haywood and 14 other members of the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, are sentenced to 20 years in prison for refusal to be drafted and for organizing the working class in the U.S. to stop the capitalist war by the working class non-participation. August 29, 1824. Nanyehi, the last beloved clan mother of the Cherokee people before their removal from their ancestral homelands. She was a matriarchal decision maker for her people before the Europeans. She led her people in successful commercial cattle raising and other enterprises which were so successful that Europeans targeted their business for appropriations. August 29, 1970. The National Chicano Moratorium demonstrations against the war in Vietnam becomes a rebellion when the police attack a peaceful crowd of tens of thousands of activists, herald a new stage in the Chicano struggle. The 36th annual Chicano Moratorium will be announced later in this program. This has been Sister Luyanda with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for Freedom Now, 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming worldwide at www.kpfk.org. And in the language of struggle of South Africa, Azania, please join us wherever you are. Amandla!
Awetu!
Amandla!
Awetu!
Amandla!
Awetu!
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is LaShawn Harris, Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University in East Lansing, and author of the book Tell Her Story, Eleanor Bumpurs and the Police Killing That Galvanized New York City. Thank you for joining us at Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, LaShawn Harris.
Thank you for having me, Professor Horne.
Thank you for joining us. So who was Eleanor Bumpurs, and why did you write a book about her?
Thank you for that question. Eleanor Bumpurs was born Eleanor Gray Bumpurs in North Carolina in August of 1918. She was a working class Black woman. She was from the generation of Black women that participated in the Second Great Migration of the 1940s. She was someone who was a loving and protective mother. She loved to dance. She loved to cook. She loved her family. And at the same time, she was someone who experienced moments of trauma, isolation, and unfulfilled desires. And she was also someone who was killed by the NYPD, particularly the Emergency Service Unit of the NYPD on October 29th, 1984, during a housing eviction. And I became interested in this particular case for several reasons. I grew up seeing this kind of iconic 1981 New York Daily News photo of Eleanor Bumpurs as a child. I grew up hearing her name in music songs, particularly hip hop music, and also in movies such as Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing and also his film She's Gotta Have It. And I was also someone who lived right across the street from Eleanor Bumpurs. She lived we both lived in the Bronx off of University Avenue, off of like 170 something street. It would be, if you're from New York, it would be like the Mount Eden train stop. But I lived across the street from her. I was 10 years old when she was killed. And I wanted to think about and write about something that happened in my neighborhood that really upended my community. And I was really curious about who Eleanor was before she was murdered by the police. I wanted to know about her personal histories. I wanted to know, what she was like, where she was from, what types of dreams and aspirations did she have for her family. And I wanted to know who she was as a mother, a friend, a neighbor, and as someone who had a lifetime of experiences. And most importantly, I wanted to really think about and explore what political activism looked like for Eleanor Bumpurs. And she's significant to the story of police brutality in the 1980s, in particular in New York, because she really represents an early iteration of what Kimberly Crenshaw would call the Say Her Name movement in 2014, which is a movement that shines a light on the police brutality and the police killings of Black women and girls.
Now, speaking of police killing of Black women and girls, perhaps you could broaden the lens and contextualize this question. Many in Los Angeles, no doubt, are familiar with a similar killing of Eula May Love by the LAPD in early 1979, which led to massive outcry. And of course, both of the police officers who were involved in this slaying were exonerated by the district attorney. What would be the context for killing of Black women and girls? Are they, for example, slain more often by the authorities than women and girls of other ancestries, for example?
Black women and girls throughout the long 20th century have these kind of everyday encounters with police. And I know when we think about police brutality and particularly police killings, we tend to think about Black men and boys, and we tend to think that, Black men and boys have more encounters with police. Black women and girls have the same encounters. And their encounters tend to be these kind of everyday violations, everyday harms. Black women are, harassed by police on a daily basis in public settings, in private settings. Black women are, racial epithets are waged, are leveraged against Black women. And we see that, at least in the case of Eula Love, Eleanor Bumpurs, Deborah Danner, who was killed by the NYPD in 2016, that a lot of these occurrences are happening, at least in the late 1970s, early and throughout the 1980s, in the homes of Black women. So, these really sacred spaces that Black women have become, that they've called homes, become these sort of, killing grounds for Black women. So if we're looking for like some of those kind of nuances in talking about like gender and police violence, I think the home, looking at Black women being accosted and violated in their homes, is a good way of trying to parse out the nuances of gendered police violence, because Eula Love and Eleanor Bumpurs were both killed in their home. Actually, Eula Love was killed outside of her home in front of her children, but it was still in a domestic space. And we know that Black women, at least during the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, have these encounters more encounters like this with police, because of the war on crime and because of the war on drugs, where police officers and special unit police units are going into Black homes and looking for all types of drugs and drug paraphernalia.
Now, back to the Bumpurs case. Talk to us about Reverend Herbert Daltry of Brooklyn and what role he plays in your story.
Yeah, thank you for that. Herbert Daltry was a is a longtime pastor, longtime political activist, and his organization, the Black United Front, as well as several chapters of the Black United Front, particularly the chapter in the Bronx, where Eleanor Bumpurs is from, becomes one of the key organizations to really help the Bumpurs family. They become some of the first activists to stage like candlelight vigils, church events, as well as protests in both Brooklyn Street and in the Bronx. And he also becomes, and this is through several of my interviews with Mary Bumpurs, and Mary Bumpurs is Eleanor Bumpurs, her second oldest daughter. And she becomes a political activist. She really becomes a spokesperson for the family. Daltry and Mary Bumpurs become friends as a result of, this tragedy. So this is someone who is offering his community contacts, his political contacts to the family. This is someone who is really kind of schooling Mary Bumpurs and her family about activism and the long-standing battle against police brutality in New York City. And this is someone, Herbert Daltry becomes that person who offers the family, just comfort and prayers. And Daltry is just like Wendell Foster, another pastor who was from the Bronx. They stay with the family until, the person that killed Eleanor Bumpurs, Stephen Sullivan, the officer, until his trial, which is in 1987. So Daltry and his church, as well as his family, they become these sort of friends and political activists for the family, just supporting them in various types of ways, even supplementing money for Eleanor Bumpurs' funeral.
Also, in terms of broadening the lens, talk to us about Viola Plummer, I should say the late Viola Plummer, and what role she plays in this story, along with a group with which she was affiliated. I'm speaking of the New York 8 against fascist terrorism.
I don't, in my book, I describe the New York 8 as a group of political activists from various parts of the city, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and also the Bronx, who are you know, really targeted by New York State, particularly Rudy Giuliani and the federal government for political speech, and this is sometime in the early to mid 1980s, and I describe what happens to them being, arrested and held in police custody as a form of police violence against Black women. And they fit into this kind of nexus of, again, Black women being, really violated in their homes. So that's the way they fit into this particular story. It's unclear to me, and I know this is probably, I know there's more to it, but it's not clear to me in terms of their political activism for the Bumpurs case. But they are their story and what happens to them in terms of, police interaction is part of this kind of history during the 1980s, where police are really ramping up raids against Black homes, particularly Black women.
What about the mayor at that time, Mayor Edward Cotch? What role does he play in your story?
Mayor Edward Cotch is someone who is elected in the late 1970s, and Cotch supports the NYPD. He supports, Stephen Sullivan's split action decision to shoot Eleanor Bumpurs during an eviction. He is someone, when Stephen Sullivan is indicted in late January of 1985, he supports that. He does not support the decision that the grand jury indicted him. And he is someone who is a pro-police, pro-business person. At many different turns, this is someone who is part of a system in New York City that really tried to shame and criticize the Bumpurs family. In November of 1984, which is a few weeks after Eleanor was killed in October 29th, 1984, Cotch says that he'll put out a citywide report about what happened to Eleanor Bumpurs. And in that report, Cotch, as well as other, city commissioners at the time, they essentially blamed the family for not taking care of Eleanor Bumpurs. So they charged them with neglect, elderly neglect. They charged them with not the family with. They charged them with knowing about this eviction but not doing anything. So he really publicly shames the family and takes the side of the police. It's also important to understand that the next year is an election year. So, part of this is about Cotch really keeping favor with the NYPD as well as the very large police union, the BPA, and also keeping in favor with white voters. And some of these white voters who end up supporting Stephen Sullivan, these are people who are, Republicans, or they are conservative Democrats. Many live in the city, many don't live in the city, who are, anti-immigrant, they're anti-Black, they're anti-liberal. So a lot of his support for the police is about, being reelected in 1985.
You've mentioned the man who pulled the trigger a number of times, Stephen Sullivan. Talk to us about him, and talk to us as to whether or not he was ever brought to justice.
Stephen Sullivan was a career cop. At the time of the shooting, he had been a cop for at least 10 to 15 years. And he was from Putnam County, upstate New York. He was a father. He had 2 teenage children. And it takes a long time to bring him to justice. So he shoots Eleanor Bumpurs in October of 1984. He's indicted at the end of January of 1985 by grand jury in the Bronx. That case is brought to the grand jury by Bronx District Attorney Mario Marola. And that indictment is thrown out by an upper court. Marola repeals that indictment, and it goes to another court in the state, and it's also the vacating that indictment is upheld. The indictment is not upheld, and by November of 1986, it goes to the New York Supreme Court, and the New York Supreme Court decides to uphold the indictment. So Stephen Sullivan does not see the inside of a courtroom until January of 1987. Meanwhile, Eleanor Bumpurs had been shot in 1984. So it's a 3-year legal battle for activists, these kind of ups and downs of the judicial system. And eventually, I think most people probably know this, but Stephen Sullivan elects to have a bench trial, which is a trial by a judge. And that decision was prompted by his attorney, who was paid for by the police union, and they decide to have a bench trial by judge because of another case that happened a year prior, which is the Michael Griffin case in 1986, where a Black man and his friends, they were from Brooklyn. They had ventured into the Queens section of Howard Beach, which was an insular community, working and middle-class Italian community known to be racist to Blacks. And those 4 Black men were harassed and beat. And Michael Griffin was chased onto a 6-lane freeway and hit by a motorist. And because New York City was, racially divided, on a whole host of different incidents, the Howard Beach kind of intensified that white and Black dynamic. And Stephen Sullivan and his attorney decided that they didn't want to take a chance with a multiracial Bronx jury. So they decided to have this bench trial.
And he was convicted?
He was acquitted.
I see.
He was acquitted. So, when we think about, at least during this time, at least for the family, getting Stephen Sullivan, getting him indicted, and getting him to see the inside of a courtroom even before a judge was bittersweet, because we know that during the 80s, there were many different cases. The case of Edmund Perry, 1985, prep school student from Harlem who was shot by a cop in Harlem. We can go to other cases where there is no indictment at all, right? So for the family, getting him indicted and getting him in front of a judge was a blessing, because they didn't think that was going to happen. The family was also upset because Stephen Sullivan was not charged. He wasn't indicted for murder. He was indicted for manslaughter. And the family, as well as Daltry, believed that he should have been indicted for murder. It's bittersweet for them to they get this trial, which there is a blessing, but it's also bittersweet because now they have to sit through a court proceeding where they know that their mother will be, defamed and shamed, and they have to hear the details of how she was killed. But for that time, just getting an indictment and getting someone before a judge or a jury is a blessing for many families, because a lot of families don't get that.
Mm. What about a civil suit? Did the family sue for damages?
Yeah, the family does. The family files a lawsuit in December of 1984. This is a few months after Eleanor Bumpurs was killed. And the suit is not settled until the early 90s, when David Dinkins becomes mayor. And it's important to note that David Dinkins was an Eleanor Bumpurs supporter. He attended her funeral with Herbert Daltry. He marched in the street with Herbert Daltry and others. He questioned the police. He, gave statements to the press about, this was a essentially a murder of a poor person. And he's the one to settle the case. He doesn't settle it personally, but the city's team of lawyers settle the case. The family decides not to have not to go to court. They settle out of court. And the lawsuit was brought for $10 million. $10 million. And they get less than, the city gives them at least 400 and some odd $1,000, but they eventually in their pockets get a little under $200,000, which is a far cry from, the $10 million lawsuit.
Mm-hmm. And of course, David Dinkins was the first Black mayor of the city.
Yes.
Finally, LaShawn Harris, Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University, author of the book Tell Her Story. What's next on your agenda?
You know what? I guess I'm supposed to have an academic answer for this. I'm working on 2 projects. One project is the serial murder of Black women in DC during the late 1930s, early 1940s. And the second project is a biography on Madam Stephanie Sinclair, who was a 1920s, 1930s numbers banker in New York City.
Mm-hmm. And a sort of godmother of organized crime in Harlem, as I recall.
Yeah, yes, she was.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Harris, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Stefan Bradley, Charles Hamilton Houston class of 1915, professor of Black Studies and History at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and author of the book If We Don't Get It, A People's History of Ferguson. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Stefan Bradley.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Horne, my history hero and mentor at times, idol, and many more times. It means the world to be here with you and with Anthony Ballas, who's been doing excellent work. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
Well, I think there was a number of different reasons why I finally decided to put this book together. I didn't initially want to write the book because I feared that some of the organizers and activists might think that I was trying to take financial advantage of the movement, this happens so frequently when we talk about the Black liberation movement is people, the people on the ground don't necessarily always see the money and proceeds from things. And so I was there in St. Louis, in Ferguson, when Mike Brown unfortunately lost his life on August 9th, 2014. He lost his life to Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson. I was the director of the Black Studies program at St. Louis University at the time, and so I was, working on a project dealing with youth rebellion in the Ivy League, where I even mentioned your name, Professor Horne. But it occurred to me that this is history occurring. This is history happening in the moment. But I didn't have the heart to do it, and so I waited a good while to have a little bit of space And I got to thinking about it and thinking that I wasn't a frontliner. I was out there. I stayed out there with them almost a year. Uh, um, but I was never the one leading the demonstrations or anything like that. So I started thinking like, what exactly could my role in the movement be? And I don't have very many skills, but maybe teaching and writing could be a couple of them. And so that's why I put the book together. I think if I were being more poetic, I really took inspiration from Chinua Achebe, who had spent some time out here where I am now in Amherst, Massachusetts. He had said that until the lions have their own historians, the tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. And so part of what I write in the book is that I've seen the lions up close, and they're fierce and they're fearless and they're courageous, and they deserve to be included in the pages of history. And so I wanted to include the people that would likely never make the pages of history were it not for this uprising and this movement in a sleepy little town. So to me, including these unlikely leaders, these what I call young Democrats, small d Democrats, not the party, but those who believe in democracy. I think they rescued American democracy for a moment, and I felt that they needed to be etched in the pages of history.
So describe to us that incident in August 2014 when Michael Brown, a Black teenager, was slain by a Euro-American officer. What triggered this tragedy?
Again, I wasn't in the Canfield Green apartment complex when this happened. So, but students of mine were nearby, and they had been texting me, letting me know that a young man had been shot out in Ferguson. And at first I thought, oh no, that's terrible. But I've heard of people being shot in North County, St. Louis before. And so it wasn't regular, but it's just, it's unfortunately in the United States something you get sensitized to or desensitized to. And then the student kept texting, kept calling, saying that they hadn't picked the body up off of the ground. And this was for hours. Mike Brown, who was shot by Darren Wilson, a white officer. Mike Brown was just made 18 years old, had graduated high school from an unaccredited high school, but graduated nonetheless, had plans on going to a trade school in the fall, had a confrontation with the officer, which resulted in the officer shooting through his body 6 times, and laid out on Canfield Drive. The problem with this, and you will know this well, Professor Horne, in that you came from St. Louis, is St. Louis in August is miserable in terms of the humidity, the heat. And so it was 100% humidity. There were so many people outside, so many young people, so many toddlers looking at a body that hadn't been covered up, that hadn't been removed for hours. And this was too much for the people in the complex. And responding to this in grief and in mourning were the mothers and grandmothers who hit the streets. They didn't know how to do all the chants and all that kind of stuff, but they knew that they were displeased, and they knew that it was wrong the way that this was being handled. When they hit the streets, of course, the people that America calls thugs, that is the men and women with the dreadlocks and the neck tattoos, they went out to protect their mamas, grandmamas, and aunties. And this frightened the Ferguson Police Department, frightened them so much that they brought dogs out. And this is hard to even imagine, or maybe it's not hard to imagine, but I teach about Black liberation. I teach about a time when they would sick German shepherds on peaceful protesters. Well, this was an instance where they brought out dogs on the people in the Canfield Green and the Northwind Estates. These are complexes in Ferguson, and everything escalated from there. Later on, a gas station would be burned, and people would take to the streets with a willingness to shut things down. And so that became the chant: if we don't get it, shut it down. And that's what happened to the streets. That's what happened to several of the businesses and other sorts of institutions at the time.
Now, of course, there are other events that lead up to this tragedy. For example,
Absolutely.
subsequent reporting went into detail about how Black Ferguson was being looted systematically by dint of parking tickets and fines and the like. And of course, there's also a history of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid in that area. Talk to us about that.
Sure. So not to bore you, you know all of this so well after your neighborhood, of course, was displaced by St. Louis University. I'm talking about Mill Creek Valley. Several of there was something in St. Louis that we call white flight, where after Brown versus Board of Education, when the public schools attempted to desegregate, white people left to the counties, and they left out to North County. So they built those freeways that allowed them to go out to North County. When they did, shortly afterwards, those Black people who could afford it, they moved out to North County as well. It remained a suburban quiet area, but then of course some other issues occurred in terms of American housing. So America largely turned its back on this idea of public housing, and some of the projects in St. Louis City were knocked down. So you'll remember the Pruitt-Igoe, you remember the Blue Myers and some other apartment complexes, what they call projects, were destroyed, and the people were displaced, and those people would go out to North County. They were going out to a place where they were not welcome, and so you speak of Jim Crow. This was the proposition. Many in St. Louis and St. Louis County, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of municipalities. Mostly because people didn't want to live around Black people, so they would establish new municipalities along the way. As a result, if you're driving from St. Louis City to Ferguson, you could get 5 or 6 different tickets just getting to Ferguson from different municipalities with different police forces. And so in Ferguson, that became a primary I guess the primary way of making money through traffic fines, through traffic fees. So you would get tickets, but you wouldn't get one ticket at a time. You would get multiple tickets at a time. So somebody would stop you. They would say, okay, well, the light over your license plate is out. You were going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. And all of these things. And so they would stack up tickets. Your seatbelt is not on, or whatever it was. They would stack up these tickets and then say, you can pay it, or you can come to court. Well, the courts closed at, 5:30, and you couldn't bring kids there. So working people couldn't go. And then, of course, if you don't make it to court and you don't pay the fines, then they issue a warrant for your arrest. As a result, in Ferguson and a number of municipalities in North County, St. Louis, you had what were the equivalent of pauper prisons. That is, people that are in prison are in jail only because they couldn't pay for their fines. So it became dangerous to ride around. What they ended up finding out with a Civil Rights Commission study and a federal investigation is that Ferguson had participated in patterns and practices of discrimination against Black motorists and residents. That is, the overwhelming percentage of people who were stopped and arrested and convicted and towed happened to be Black people. And this was problematic without any doubt. And people knew it. And people were willing to go along with it. But the problem was you can't kill kids and leave them in the street. I think that's when people, like, this was the straw that broke the camel's back. And if I could just take another second to talk about kind of the context at the moment was people remember Trayvon Martin and they remember Sean Bell and Eric Garner. All of this was happening at the same time. St. Louis was an interesting place because there had never been an uprising of this nature at all. Even in Kansas City in '68, when King died, there were uprisings. In Chicago, of course, there were uprisings. In various places in the Midwest, there were uprisings, Detroit, all these different places. But in St. Louis, none had occurred. So I think this is the tinder. This is the tinder that helped to fuel the fire that spread to Ferguson and back into St. Louis.
Now, I understand that some of the activists seeking justice for the murder of Michael Brown took their case to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. Talk to us about that.
Oh, this was such a beautiful moment. Definitely a beautiful moment. I have to give a special shout to attorney Justin Hansford, who is the director of the Thurgood Marshall Center at Howard Law School. He was a professor of law at St. Louis University School of Law at the time. He was a junior professor at that, but he chose to participate in the movement. I went out there because my students had called me and told me that one of my students had been pepper sprayed, tear gas, and shot with rubber pellets. And so it frightened me so much, this idea that they were shooting people. And so I was in communication with my students, and I, once I found out that they were okay, they were able to neutralize the pepper spray and clean out the tear gas. Once I found out they were okay, I begged and pleaded for them not to go out again, which was a funny thing because I had been teaching them about the Black liberation movement and Black freedom struggle. I had been teaching them in class about that. And so they said to me that there is no way on earth that they weren't going out again. And so when they decided that they were not going to stay in like I asked them to, I decided to go out with them. Justin Hansford, who had been working on, attorney at law, who had been working on getting Garvey clemency or a pardon. I'm talking about Marcus Garvey of the UNIA. He had been working on that. He had been working on several cases, had been donating his time. When this tragedy occurred, he made his way to Ferguson and tried to make himself useful. He became a political observer, a freedom observer, I guess is what they called him. He eventually got arrested for it. But I mention his name in particular because he, along with Mike Brown's parents, Leslie McSpadden and Mike Brown Sr., they went to the UN to bring the case that American police, including the state of Missouri, so Ferguson police, state police, and that the state in general was abusing Black people by mobilizing armored personnel vehicles, military equipment, by employing military-grade weapons, that is the tear gas canisters. For those who do remember or who look this up, you can see brave activists throwing tear gas canisters back with a bag of chips in their hands at the same time. But they went to the UN to make their case that this was inhumane treatment of peaceful protesters. It was such a righteous effort, definitely important. They received a hearing and were able to move on from there, but they were greatly supported from this side of the pond, and I thought it was a bold and courageous move, and it was the right move because back at home there was a great demonization that was occurring of protesters, of people willing to exercise their First Amendment rights, and those willing to speak out. So I was thankful for that, and I'm thank you for mentioning that.
Now, Officer Wilson was not convicted, if I'm not mistaken.
Not in the least. Not in the least. Darren Wilson, who lived closer to South County, did not live in Ferguson where he policed. There was not a residential requirement for police officers in Ferguson, which meant that he drove in every day, arrested or fined people, and then drove out every day. And so the only time that he would really see these Black people and where he lived, it was largely a white suburban, suburban city. So the only time that he would see large numbers of Black people was when he came to Ferguson. And the demand of the protesters on the ground, when we were on the ground, was first of all to find out his name, because the police department didn't want to release his name because they were afraid and worried about protecting him. Imagine that. He was the only one with the gun in the situation, and he needs protecting. And so they were worried about protecting him, and so it was an anguishing week before we found out his name. When they announced his name, they put out a video of Mike Brown having a confrontation in the Ferguson market with somebody, and Mike Brown taking a box of cigarillos and pushing aside somebody. And so the police were quick to call it strong arm robbery. And so that went off on Fox News. And then as though this was supposed to justify a police officer shooting an unarmed teenager. And so the call was for Darren Wilson to be indicted. And that, of course, did not happen. Robert McCullough, who was the county prosecutor at the time, refused to do so. And the night that he announced that he was not prosecuting was one of the most, one of the most memorable nights of my entire life, in all my years on the earth. I heard Michael Brown's mama shriek once we found out what was going on. She was atop a car. I heard people talking about going to get their firearms. I heard tires screeching. I eventually heard gunshots. I heard wails of people mourning. And so it was tough to take in. I think some of us assumed that Darren Wilson wouldn't be indicted, but because you're an attorney, that you can you can indict a ham sandwich. This is what the attorneys told us, that there was enough cause, according to some attorneys, to make an indictment, but that didn't happen with Mike Brown, or with Darren Wilson, and that led, in fact, to the advancement of some people's careers. For instance, Wesley Bell, who eventually took Bob McCullough's job as county prosecutor. Wesley Bell received the support of many of the activists on the ground and the organizers on the ground, on the premise that he would reopen the case on Mike Brown, the investigation, in hopes of leading to an indictment of Darren Wilson, and that, in fact, did not happen.
And then he was elected to Congress, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Cori Bush, who was driven out of Congress by the pro-Israel lobby because of her sympathy for the Palestinians, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, you follow the story well. And Cori Bush, who was on the ground, Cori Bush had done a wonderful job in the Canfield Green apartment complex of helping to provide resources to the people. Professor Horne, I have to tell you, like there was it was a real life occupation that occurred that for at least a couple days, you couldn't get into the apartment complex. They were checking IDs, so you had to be real slick in getting in. They were checking IDs of people going and coming from the apartment complex. It got so bad that brand new mothers couldn't get diapers and things like that. So some of us, some young professionals that I was working with, and others like Cori Bush and so many others, decided to get resources for the people in the Canfield Green apartment complexes. It was so harrowing and it was so traumatic for the young people in the apartment complex. And she did a wonderful job along with so many others. There are organizations that did really well. Better Family Life was one of those. The Urban League did well. Organization of Black Struggle, they did well in trying to help with matters. Grassroots, organizing to ensure that people had the things that they needed in their apartment complexes. I remember bringing water and toilet paper and all this kind of thing, these kinds of things to the complex to try to help in any way that we could because of the occupation that was occurring. The children suffered the most, in part because of all the smoke in the air. So children with asthma had big problems. So there was smoke in the air, there was tear gas in the air. Those who wanted to go to sleep at night. Now, mind you, school was supposed to be starting in the next week or two, but that got delayed. But at night, you would hear helicopters thumping all over the place, and you would hear people protesting. You hear chants all over the place, and then there were fires that were set too. So what I'm saying is that the children were suffering psychologically, sometimes physiologically as well. And so you had psychologists who went into and therapists who went into the Canfield Green apartment complex to try to speak to these young people, to try to help them to think their way through all of this, because at the schools, it was forbidden to talk about the Ferguson uprising. So these young people were really in need, and you mentioned Cori Bush. That just jogged my memory of all of the things that were happening at the time, and how helpful she was, along with others, in providing for the needs of the people in the complex where Mike Brown lived.
Well, Stefan Bradley, author of the book, If We Don't Get It, A People's History of Ferguson, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
And in closing, we do want to thank everybody who donated during our recent fund drive. Thank you to our guest, LaShawn Harris. Thank you, Stefan Bradley. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Brother Brandon, Sister Flora. Thank you, Anthony Ballas, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.